In a divided world, how do you get 195 countries all on the same page? From Sao Paulo to Seoul, the Financial Times is the common thread connecting bright minds. It's read in every country recognised by the United Nations, by people who need trusted insight to make confident decisions. And with reporters in over 40 international bureaux, you can trust the FT to tell the global stories that matter, clearly and without compromise. Read more and subscribe at ft.com.
Russia's full-scale assault on Ukraine in February 2022 should have been one of those usefully clarifying pick-a-side moments, and picking a side should not have been difficult. Tyranny versus democracy, imperialism versus independence, brute force versus the apparatus of rules, laws and norms that the post-World War II world had spent 8 decades assembling. The choice, or so one might have thought, should have been an especially easy one for the countries of Central and Eastern Europe and/or the former Soviet Union, millions of whose living citizens can recall Russian tanks in their streets and walls, wire and watchtowers preventing them from leaving if Moscow's rule was not to their liking. It hasn't worked out entirely like that. One of the reasons that the annual Globsec Forum moved last year from Bratislava to Prague is that Slovakia had returned to office a Prime Minister, Robert Fico, apparently indifferent to Ukraine, at best equivocal about Russia. The Czech Republic, if polls are any guide, also seems poised to re-elect later this year its own nationalist populist Prime Minister, Andrej Babiš, who has also often seemed friendlier to Moscow than Kyiv. This special episode of The Foreign Desk, recorded at this year's Globsec Forum in Prague, considers this and other conundrums. We meet the Foreign Minister of the host nation and the former Defence Minister of Ukraine, who helped steer his country through its early months of resistance. We also speak to a president of another European country which Russia won't let go, and a former Deputy Supreme Commander of the military alliance scrambling to adjust to these shifting realities. Why does Putinist populism maintain any appeal in Russia's former dominions? Is Europe as a whole at last getting to grips with the new strategic realities? And can Ukraine's war still be won? This is the Foreign Desk.
They probably starting believe that Ukraine can win this war, but they still cannot to believe that Russia can lose this war.
Because if a Trump capitulation deal is forced through and President Zelensky is in some way forced to accept it, that is when the danger really arises.
When I hear that the European Union has a new Black Sea strategy, what does it mean without Georgia? What does it mean if Georgia is another Russia?
You're listening to The Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Muller. We were joined first at Globsec by Jan Lipavsky, Foreign Minister of the Czech Republic. Czech voters will go to the polls later this year, and polls suggest that they may follow their former compatriots in Slovakia by electing a government of far-right populists. But for the moment, the two countries have very different governments with very different outlooks, especially where Ukraine is concerned. I began by asking the minister if he was surprised that the two halves of what was once Czechoslovakia had grown so far apart.
Czechoslovakia was split, so the Slovakia can become a country and can be different. So we have to respect that, and this is part of our policy. So yes, the government is different. It has different views on to which extent support Ukraine. We are supporting Ukraine fully, and we see the threat of Russian imperialism as one of the main threats to European continent.
But when you have those conversations with your Slovakian counterpart about support for Ukraine in particular, because, and I know we've had similar conversations before, both of these countries were invaded by Russia or the Soviet Union as then
1968, it was Czechoslovakia.
Well within living memory. So when you're actually having that conversation with your counterpart and there are differences about how fervently to support Ukraine, what actually are those differences?
The starting point of our relationship is what we can do together and what we have in common. And there is a lot of other agenda besides, for example, the discussion on Ukraine. And even the discussion on Ukraine, we speak about things which can be done together. And we are speaking about infrastructural issues, energy issues, things like that. So decisively, it is not discussion about differences. It is a discussion, what can we do together? Please remember that Slovakia is a neighboring country with Ukraine, so also it has this specificity. And I'm not saying that we have the same positions, but we are looking for the ways how to do things together.
But do you have any concerns looking ahead to the elections which are due here in the Czech Republic later this year, that where Slovakia has gone, this country could be about to follow? I'm sure you're looking at the same polls that I am, which do suggest that there will be a populist wave here as well.
It might happen, it might not happen, and I'm running in Prague for the incumbent coalition to change it. And if you look at the numbers now, we are able to change the trends and we are gaining percentage, and I hope that we will be able to gain more support to our Western orientation of Czechia. And of course it is concerning that one of the founders of Patriots for Europe is now heading polls, and Andrej Babiš is a puppet of Viktor Orbán, and he's a big friend with Mr. Kickel, and he's meeting regularly with politicians like Wilders or Vox from Spain. I don't think Czechia should be part of this society.
But when you're campaigning against that, because you're not the first government in Europe which has run up against this, having to campaign against populists, for whom I think campaigning is probably pretty easy, because they're the ones who can just say that, all these problems can be easily solved, nothing is your fault, just leave it with us and we will fix everything, which of course they won't. But how do you run against that? How do you make the case that actually things are difficult and complicated and expensive and time-consuming, and that's not going to change if you elect these people?
My understanding of politics is that politics is every individual, every voter has to make own assessment what is good for them, and then cast a vote based on this assessment. And our proposal is that responsible governance in the times of polycrisis, of Russian war against Ukraine, migration crisis, inflation crisis, our government ended basically the COVID measures here in Czechia, and we also had to solve different other crises from the terrible incident shooting at the philosophical faculty towards, for example, floods. And our government was able to navigate Czechia through all of these crises. We have macroeconomically the best numbers in the region, lowest unemployment comparing to other neighbors in Central Europe. So I hope, and this is the proposal for elections, look, we have been responsibly taking care of our country. So it would be not wise to give it Andrej Babiš, who promises everything to everyone, but it will cost us a fortune.
You mentioned Ukraine before, which will obviously be a big topic of conversation at Globsec, as it has been for the last few Globsecs. What is your government, do you think, able to commit to doing between now and the next election?
The elections will be in 4 months, so it's basically after summer break. So I don't think there's many new things which can be announced. We have so many projects going on. The biggest is Czech Ammunition Initiative, which is very successful. We supplied a number of ammunition to the Ukraine front. That basically we changed the ratio from 10 to 1 to 2 to 1 in terms of the Russian figures. And we want to be truly a good ally to Ukraine in their defense against Russia. So reconstruction is also a very important part of that.
But does support for Ukraine become any kind of election issue in the Czech Republic? Is there still broad support for it? Or do you find that your opponents aren't getting or that they're getting mileage out of being Ukraine skeptical?
I think it's serving them well because they know how to play this Ukrainian card. It's not only about support to Ukraine; it's about 500,000 war refugees living here in Czechia. So there are issues connected to that. But when I was speaking about responsible behavior, about strategic behavior, to support Ukraine and to receive refugees was a strategic decision in a long term good for our country. So we are making this course and selling this in this point to our population. Of course, there's a big portion of society supporting this policy, and the others, we have to convince them, and we are working on that.
That was Jan Lipavsky, Foreign Minister of the Czech Republic. This is the Foreign Desk. You're listening to The Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Muller. Our next guest is Oleksiy Reznikov, who was Ukraine's Minister of Defence from 2001 until 2023. Earlier this month, Ukraine achieved one of its most spectacular successes of the war. Operation Spider's Web, an ingenious simultaneous drone attack on several Russian airfields, some of them thousands of kilometres from the front lines. I began by asking about Operation Spider's Web and whether he was surprised that Ukraine's Secret Service was capable of such an operation.
Me not. I was not surprised, but I really was happy and glad to hear that we did it, because I absolutely know personally Vasily Maluk, who is head of Secret Service of Ukraine. I know a lot of guys from his team. And, in Ukraine, we have special competition between different special operation units like GUR, Special Operation Forces, Secret Service, Navy, bodyguards, and all of them, like a championship we have, they're trying to reach out the new results, especially on the enemy soil. So just applause.
Because this is one of the things I wanted to ask about, what it teaches us about the culture of leadership within the Ukrainian government, Ukrainian military, Ukrainian security services, because an operation like that, first of all, somebody has to have this extraordinary, almost absurd-sounding idea, and then they have to take it to a superior, and that superior has to have the confidence and the vision to say, sure, give it a try, which I think is actually quite unusual. Where does that come from?
Again, let's come back to the autumn and winter 2021. Then it was very popular cognitive bias that Kiev will fall during 3 days or 72 hours in a case of full-scale invasion. And, we are fighting back 3 weeks, 3 months, 3 years, and we continue, and we still alive. It reminds us the very famous Bible story about David and Goliath. David was smart, brave, creative, and he used a sling and stone against the monster, against the Goliath, and he defeated him. So this is the same. This is Ukrainians. We are current Davids.
But is that perhaps a demonstration of how Russia can be defeated with that more sort of creative lateral thinking rather than the strength and mass approach?
It's again that other kind of bias that if you have manpower, like 140 million population, you will prevail. But it's not true, because against the massive armed forces, against the troops, we're using creative approach, we're using cutting-edge technologies like electronic warfare, and this war became a new type of hybrid war, because we and our enemies still using conventional weaponry, like during the Second World War, like battle tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, artillery systems, modern air defense systems, fighter jets, but simultaneously we're using a future generation weaponry. We have lasers, we have drones, anti-drones, and other type of things, and AI capability also is involved from both sides. So this war, its lesson should be learned. This war, it's a new type of war on a globe.
Do you think even Ukraine's allies, friends and supporters are still perhaps underrating Ukraine somewhat? You said earlier that everybody assumed that the country would fold up in 72 hours of a full-scale invasion. That is true. That was the predominating opinion at the time. But there is still, or at least it strikes me, that when Ukraine's allies, certainly in recent months and primarily the United States, have started to sort of pressure Ukraine into finding some sort of accommodation with Russia, that it's almost like they think Ukraine still needs to be rescued from this, that Ukraine is in over its head.
I would say that they probably starting believe that Ukraine can win this war, but they still cannot to believe that Russia can lose this war, because for them the losing of this war from the Russian side means collapse of the Russian Federation, collapse of the Russian Empire. And they see 5 threats. First, it's a non-controlling proliferation of nuclear power. 1. Migration waves in Europe, massive, 10 million and more. Rising of Islamic radicalism on their territory. Strengthening of China influence on their territory. And vulnerability of the oil and gas and other energy resources. But in reality, these threats we see. Russia used migrants as a weaponry to the Lithuania, to the Poland. They did it from the Belarus and from their territory. They're using the nuclear club like threatening device. We see the Islamic radicalism on their territory. We see that Russia became the youngest brother of the China. China is a beneficiary of this war between Russia and Ukraine, because China buying very, very cheap oil and gas and other resources and giving them their technologies. And we see that oil and gas so became a vulnerability. But it's remind me like a very famous speech of Bush, senior president of the United States in 1991 in Kyiv. It's a very famous speech calling Chicken Kyiv speech, when he trying to stop independence way of Ukraine from the USSR.
And you said that it's other politicians who identify those 5 threats or 5 hazards, I guess, of a Russian defeat. And I don't think any of them are entirely without merit. But what's your view? I know you spoke recently and described Russia as a paper tiger, but supposing Ukraine does win this war, and suppose Russia is demonstrably beaten on the battlefield and Vladimir Putin has lost, what do you think does actually happen after that?
It would be 2 consequences, main consequences. It will show to the world that democracy can win against the autocracy. It will keep China staying without aggression in Taiwan. It means that United States and other allies will not have to think, are they ready to protect Taiwan or not? Japan, South Korea. So it's a question of the might is right will win, or rule-based order will win. And second consequences means that it's options for the Russians' future generation to build up normal, modern, democratic regime on their territory.
That's an extremely optimistic analysis all round.
I am always optimistic. When I met this full-scale invasion in February 2022, I kept my optimism. I'm still keeping. That's why I can survive.
I mean, as we were just saying before we started recording, I visited Ukraine recently for the first time since the full-scale war began, and I have to say I was struck by how much optimism there still is among Ukrainians and how much determination there is among Ukrainians. And when I raised that with people, they sort of looked at me like it was the dumbest thing they'd ever heard and said, what choice do we have? But nobody can do this forever. No country can do this forever. And as we were also saying, this is 3.5 years longer than most people thought Ukraine would last. But do you get any sense at all that Ukraine's endurance, that its morale, that its patience, that its strength is ebbing anywhere at all?
Probably, maybe we have a special secret in our blood, like sense of humor. Because when we see the monster against us, we're trolling them. Just check our social media. You will see a lot of memes, a lot of trolling against our enemies. And it's really helped to stay. It makes our resistance and resilience on a high level. And also, we fight all our history. 300 years ago, 200 years ago. And when Ukraine was a part of Russian Empire, the bravest and best soldiers was from the Ukraine, with the Ukrainian family names.
That was Alexei Reznikov, former Minister of Defense of Ukraine. You're listening to The Foreign Desk. This is The Foreign Desk on Monocle Radio. Almost until the moment Russia unleashed its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, there were many policymakers and pundits who didn't believe Russia would be either so flagrant or so foolish. One who did see Russia coming from a way off was the retired British general and NATO's former Deputy Supreme Allied Commander Europe, Sir Richard Shirreff, whose 2016 book, 2017, War with Russia, proved depressingly prescient. Sir Richard, now co-founder at Strategia Worldwide, has also been an enthusiastic proponent of European rearmament and European self-defence. I began by asking if he felt like Europe was, at last, getting the message.
The dial is changing. It is ramping up. It is beginning to get the message. But is it getting it quick enough? Is it turning that getting the message into action? It's sort of doing it slowly, but not as quick as it needs to do it.
But has momentum increased at all with the arrival of a new government in Berlin? And this is where I ask a British general if he's excited by German rearmament.
Well, he is. He's really excited if it happens again. I think it's really ramped up since the arrival of a new government in Washington. I mean, the 20th of January is a day that is marked in everybody's diaries as when the world changed. Coming back to the question, though, yeah, I think the potential for Germany, if the Chancellor can get through that, get the debt brake removed and really start putting money into defence, it is a game changer. It is the Zeitenwende we've been waiting for. There's a little niggle at the back of my mind, though, which is about is Germany as a country really ready for it? I mean, I've, in common with anybody of my generation, lived in Germany for many years. And I think we have to understand that Germany is fundamentally a pacifist country, where the notion of the use of force by the state still is an issue. In a way, it's not an issue in France and the UK.
Do you think, because I've been struck by that a few times myself, I remember a couple of years ago talking to an extremely senior former German diplomat at a time when Germany was getting yelled at by a lot of people, possibly yourself included, about its reluctance to send Leopard tanks to Ukraine, which was what Ukraine wanted at the time. And this person said to me, he said, you have to understand that for many, many Germans, the spectacle of, he said, literally panzers being loaded onto trolleys and sent east to fight the Russians does stir up a lot of stuff that Germans are very uncomfortable with.
I can understand that. I remember the sight of German Leopard 2s with black crosses on them crossing over into Kosovo in 1999 and thinking, yes, Germany's back. This is exactly what we want.
I mean, does that have an effect, though, on... I'm asking you to draw on your recollections of national politicking within NATO. I mean, you're, I'm sure, familiar with the remark attributed to the First Secretary-General Baron Ismay that the purpose of NATO was to keep the Americans in, the Russians out, and the Germans down. But might some of the more traditional powers, France and the United Kingdom in particular, perhaps deep down where they live, be slightly unhappy that their position at the top of the table could be challenged somewhat?
Well, there might be, but they've got to get used to it. Because at the end of the day, if Germany is investing in defence on a scale much greater than France and Britain, they've got to get used to it. And so Britain particularly has got to really look at itself. And there's a lot of talk about leading within NATO. I think we should be watching Sir Keir Starmer's body language pretty carefully in a couple of weeks at the NATO summit when he's asked to spend 5% of GDP on defence. He'll look as if he's sucking lemons, I suspect, if he's asked that question.
Do you have a clear view in your head about how different, say, the British military might look 10, 20 years from now, not only measured against what it looks like now, but what it did when you were serving? I mean, you were King's Royal Hussars, so you're a tank guy. Where are you on the idea that those great big heavyweights of the battlefield, whether it is tanks, whether it is crewed aircraft, whether it is large artillery pieces, are all going to be made redundant by swarms and swarms of drones which can go anywhere?
I don't think they are going to be made redundant by swarms of drones. Warfare has always been about pulling together an orchestra of capabilities in which the strengths of one outweigh the weaknesses of another. And I think you see this in the defence review, that there's a recognition, and the Ukrainians are doing this. Armour has its place. Not great fleets of armour in the way that perhaps we grew up with in the cold days of the Cold War, but you've still got to be able to mallet the opposition. You've still got to be, and firepower, mobility, and protection are still fundamental if you are to get your people forward into a position where they can, put crudely, either kill the enemy, make him surrender, or make him run away in order to recapture ground. But the way you do it, and the way we'll do it in 10 years' time, is so different. But it'll still be a combined arms mix of more traditional capabilities together with drone swarms put together and initiated by artificial intelligence. Absolutely. It's just a question of how that balance shifts.
Well, let's come back to the question which I know is besetting this Globsec as it has beset the last few Globsecs, which is the one about Ukraine and the immediate future thereof. Do you think we're getting any closer to understanding how and when this ends?
It's not being stated clearly. The only way this thing ends is when Putin recognizes Zelensky as president of Ukraine, recognizes the Ukrainian constitution and Ukraine's right to exist as a country, and is prepared to engage in meaningful discussions. That is only going to happen when Russia is defeated on the battlefield in Ukraine. And that's a requirement, and the requirement for that is a properly thought through strategy by NATO, the West. I think you've got to rule America out of this, and so it's up to Europe and Canada to do this, to put together a strategy designed to support Ukraine to achieve that end state. And until people state that requirement clearly, this thing will go on.
Just on that point of Europe doing it alone, even when there had been that sort of, certainly after the Munich Security Conference, what felt like a kind of perpetual rolling emergency summit of European leaders trying to understand what Vice President Vance had said, Sir Keir Starmer was among those who floated this idea of a coalition of the willing. What we haven't really heard yet is exactly what it might be willing to do. In your view, is it going to become necessary to send European troops into Ukraine?
At some stage, yes. Once that peace that I've just described, once Russia has been defeated, then that peace will need to be maintained. And the only way that peace can be maintained long term is through Ukrainian membership of NATO. And that will require European troops on the ground and European aircraft in the skies above Ukraine to act as a deterrent.
And do you think, just finally, that Europe has adjusted itself sufficiently or prepared sufficiently for the nightmare scenario, which I know you've been warning of for some years, which is some sort of Russian test of NATO, a provocation designed to discover whether or not Article 5 actually means anything?
It's absolutely linked to what we've just been talking about. Because if a Trump capitulation deal is forced through and President Zelensky is in some way forced to accept it, which I don't believe they will for a moment, but just suppose that did happen, that is when the danger really arises. Because looking at it from, as we always should do, look at it from the enemy's perspective. What does he see? He sees a NATO potentially in disarray. He sees an American president who's given to him on a plate two of Putin's most prized foreign policy objectives. He's decoupled America from European security, and he's held NATO below the waterline. That's when Putin thinks, I might just have a go at the Baltic states because NATO is not going to do anything.
That was General Sir Richard Shirreff, co-founder of Strategia Worldwide and former NATO Deputy Supreme Allied Commander Europe. This is the Foreign Desk. This is the Foreign Desk on Monocle Radio. The last few decades in the history of Georgia have resembled a trial run for what Russia has attempted and may yet attempt in Ukraine. First, the inflammation of domestic conflict, followed by the implanting of puppet breakaway statelets. Second, full-scale military assault. Third, the capture of the state by pro-Moscow interests. In Georgia, this third stage has taken place against the resistance of large-scale street protests and resulted in a standoff between Georgian President Mikhail Kavalashvili, installed by Georgia's pro-Russian parliament in December, and President Salome Zurabishvili, elected by Georgia's people in 2018. President Zurabishvili previously spoke to us at the Munich Security Conference in February. I began by asking if much had changed in Georgia since then.
For the worse, yes. What we're seeing is practically every day new layers of repression, new laws that are taken, new measures, new arrests. Everything that can be done to limit, restrict the freedom of expression, freedom of demonstration, or any individual freedoms, everything practically is done. We're not very far from Belarus in some ways, but we are far enough because there is still a very active civil society and protest movement that is alive, and political opposition that is alive also, despite the fact that this last week 4 or 5 political leaders have been arrested, and probably we can expect more in the coming days. So it's an evolving situation, and one that is evolving towards the worst. The state capture of Georgia by Russia is going on.
Do you have any concerns now, though, that the rest of Europe has kind of resigned itself to the situation in Georgia? We saw Georgia's Prime Minister, Irakli Kobakidze, who is of the Georgian Dream party. He turned up at the European Political Community Summit in Tirana, which is not the EU, but nonetheless he appeared to be quite warmly spoken to by President Macron of France, Prime Minister Donald Tusk of Poland, among others. Are you concerned that the EU is starting to just sort of
first of all,
it?
I wouldn't say that the warmly, I think, is a bit excessive. We've just read Prime Minister Tusk's declarations on Georgia.
True enough.
And that's the policy that I think Poland is following.
I do just want to pick up on that quickly, because as you'll be aware, whenever the current government of Georgia is asked about the EU, they are still saying that they see this as an aspiration. The Prime Minister, Irakli Kobakidze, has said it. The Deputy Prime Minister, Levan Davidashvili, said he wants it by 2030. Are they serious about any of this, or are they just saying that because they know that's what they have to say?
They are not at all serious about that. It's very clear every decision that they have been taking in the past 2 or 3 years are going in the direction that is the direction inspired or required by Russia. But they still need to take into account some part of their own supporters and what we all knew about Georgia, which is that 80% and more of the population was in favor of the European integration, means that it's true also of their own supporters that are now supporting, for different reasons, the ruling party for personal interest or political interest, but they still want Europe. So they cannot completely neglect those people and tell them openly that they're taking them to where no Georgian wants to go, which is under the control and domination of Russia. But that is clearly where we're going. We are today a repressive regime that looks very much like Belarus or Russia.
You talked earlier about wanting to see more of a coherent policy towards Georgia from the EU. What would that actually involve? What would you like to hear them say?
What I would like does not matter as much as what I think European Union needs, which is to qualify what's happening in Georgia, because it's really a challenge to European Union. It's a challenge to us, and we clearly understand the extent of the challenge. But the European Union has to understand that it is confronted to a new hybrid strategy of Russia that is using not military intervention as in the case of Ukraine, but using manipulation of elections, propaganda, all kinds of technologies, and including to have a ruling party that is more or less under its control. All of these elements can be applied tomorrow. If the test in Georgia appears to be valid, it can be applied tomorrow to any European countries. And in fact, we have seen attempts in Romania to do the same thing. We've seen attempts that failed in Moldova, but that's something that Russia is clearly putting to a test. The same way as in 2008, it tested military intervention in Georgia before testing it elsewhere. And if it's successful in Georgia, which was probably the country in the whole of the Soviet Union the most resistant to Soviet propaganda, to Soviet domination, then it can probably work in many other places. So it's really a challenge to the EU's foreign policy, to the enlargement policy, and to see that the EU has no other reaction but to here and there protest this law, this arrest, but it's very punctual. It's not the expression of a policy, that it's not acceptable. When I hear that the European Union has a new Black Sea strategy, what does it mean without Georgia? What does it mean if Georgia is another Russia? We control the shore, then on the other side there is Romania. It's no coincidence that Russia has been testing those countries that are around the Black Sea, because Russia too knows that the Black Sea security and strategy in the Black Sea is very important for the future.
But in the nearer term, and thinking more domestically, those protests are ongoing. As you see it, is there an end point? Is there a conclusion? Is there an outcome those protests want? Are you trying to somehow force fresh elections, or?
Yeah, that is the aim. It's to force fresh elections, but for that we need three elements. One is the protest on the street. The other one is the consolidation of the opposition, which is not easy, but which I'm trying to, and it's getting better. And the third one is the support from outside, the pressure from outside. It has to be a declared policy. The United States, strangely, has more of a policy. The Megobarry Act is an expression of the policy towards Georgia, which shows very clearly what happens if the ruling party accepts to come back to the path that was Georgia's path before and sets new elections, or what happens if they continue in the direction where they are going. We need to have that type of a policy from the European Union, and a clear policy of conditionality that sets sanctions and carrots and sticks depending on what will be the decision. And that has to be made clear to the Georgian public opinion also. They have to understand that they are not forgotten, that they are seen, and that there is a clear vision of what should be the relation between EU and Georgia.
Just finally, I was looking for an insight into what your days are like now, how you go about trying to exercise the role of president without, I guess, the traditional authorities and accoutrements that would usually go with that role. How do you, I guess, keep the idea alive that you are the president of Georgia? Yeah, what is a working day for you like now?
Well, it's mostly right now to organize the opposition platform, which I've initiated and which is gathering the opposition, pro-European opposition parties, and to try to keep them together to express their policies, to try to have them also work in coordination outside. That's one very important part of the work, because without a unified or coordinated opposition, it's very difficult to go further. And the other part is to have close contacts with the protesters movement, which are very different from the classical opposition parties, with the families of the political prisoners, with the media, all the parts of the society that are suffering today from the different measures that have been taken by the authorities, and try to see how one can support them, which is getting more and more difficult. And the other part of is what I'm doing here, which is meeting with our partners, trying to keep them afloat with what's happening in Georgia, giving interviews so that the European public opinion also is aware of what's happening in Georgia, which is quite difficult given the other crises around that are competing with us in that sense.
Because one of the reasons, just as a final thought, that I think Ukraine has been able to keep such a focus on itself, it's obviously what Russia has done in Ukraine in recent years is much more dramatic, but there's also Ukraine has been able to tell this story that what matters here doesn't just matter to Ukraine, that it matters to all of Europe, that it matters in fact to the wider world.
Well, that is a message.
Is there a case you can make about Georgia along those same lines?
A stronger case, I think, because the military intervention in Ukraine is something that mattered in the sense that it affects security, but it really, in the end, is a process that can be only applied to countries that are neighboring Russia. Whereas the strategy that Russia is now testing in Georgia, which is a less costly one than the military one that has not really given the result that was expected by Russia.
This is the state capture idea.
The state capture can work with less cost and much more efficiently if what they're testing here works, and that can be applied anywhere in Europe. I talked to the president of the European Council, and I said that can be applied to Portugal, which is not true of the military intervention unless Russia starts a third world war. But so that's much more, and it's much more in the realm of what Russia can do, because it's the soft power, the propaganda, the cyber attacks. It's all of the things that an ex-KGB agent, and there are no X's, can understand much better and knows much better.
That was President Salome Zurabishvili of Georgia. This is the Foreign Desk. And that's it for this episode of The Foreign Desk. We'll be back next week with more from Globsec, and look out for the Foreign Desk Explainer, available every Wednesday. The Foreign Desk was produced by Anita Riota and Lily Austin. Lily also produces the Foreign Desk Explainer. To contact the Foreign Desk team, you can email Anita at aer@monocle.com, and don't forget to subscribe to Monocle magazine and to our free daily email bulletins by heading to our website at monocle.com. From me, Andrew Mullett, thank you very much for listening. Until next time, goodbye.